How's it going? So this is going to be a super confusing video. This is advanced topic. So if you don't have very good and solid knowledge of AngularJs, this is not video. This video is not for you, basically. Okay, I'm going to talk about scopes when you're creating custom directives. Okay, so when you're creating custom directives, you have three scopes. Well, not three scopes. You can put three values for scope: true, false, or empty object. So I'm gonna break them down and show you what do they mean, and also I'm gonna post in the description below this explainer by ChatGPT. Again, if you do not have good understanding of Angular, you probably won't understand what the hell is going on. Okay, so let's talk about the false. So basically you can rewrite this as a Boolean value, which would be like something like this: should we create new scope? Okay, and then we can say true, false, or false. This will make sense for this. Okay, and then this one I will cover a little bit later. It's a little bit different, but let's focus on should we create new scope, true or false. So when we set it to false, we do not create new scope at all. So this scope in here is basically, so this is the parent controller. So this scope and this scope are exactly the same. They are literally exactly the same. It's equivalent to simply taking the code and putting it in here. It's literally the same, because all changes in the parent will affect the child as well. So this is how it works. You see, we created, well, let's do step by step. First, let's create we created the custom directive, and let's create a variable inside the child. So there is the variable, which is called dir variable. Let's just do it this way. Now let's go to the index and let's see if we can see this variable. So hold on a sec, let me see. Okay, so where's the template? Okay, so we need to put this in here. So dir var. Okay, so we can see it. So we can see this variable because it's inside the child. So the next question is, can the parent see it? Okay, so what we can do is we can console log this scope, which is the child scope, and then we can console log the parent scope. Okay, so let's do, god damn it, let's do parent scope. Okay, so if my theory is right, both parent and child, well, I renamed this to child. Okay, so it will be easier to see. Okay, so now look, here's the parent scope. We can see dir var, which is actually in the child. So you see this variable is created in child, but parent can still see it. Because again, when you are declaring scope as false, it will inherit the scope from the parent. So whether you create it in here, whether you create variable in here or in here, it makes no difference. They will be all, they'll be in sync. Okay? So we can do something, we can prove that by, for example, let's say we create a parent string. We call this parent string. Parent string. Well, let's do string, I guess. And then we can see, does the child see this parent string? Because we're not passing it through properties, we're just blindly using it in the template. And we can see that it immediately works. So you don't need to put any mumbo jumbo because they are in sync, you see. So you see both scopes have exactly, it's basically exactly the same scope, so you're not inheriting anything. All right, so this is when you set the scope to false. It would simply inherit it from the parent, and this becomes just a template to restructure your code, but from functionality perspective, it's equivalent to doing everything. It's basically like you can just call child stuff and then do everything in here. As opposed to doing this, you're just creating a separate directive, which is a component, and then just doing it in there. Just for visual purposes, it's easier to separate, but functionality wise, it's exactly the same. All right, so this is false case. So now let's talk about true case. Now, true case is, again, it's equivalent to creating a controller. So when you create a controller, you have immediate access to the parent. So let's say you created one parent controller and then you create the child controller. Child controller will instantly inherit the parent scope variables. But here's a big but. But the changes in child will not affect the parent. So think about when you have false, both parent and child are in sync. When you have this set to true, it's like it becomes basically like React. It doesn't become like React. But the flow, it comes from parent. Well, let me just draw it out. One sec, let me just draw it out. Okay, so look, when we have false, right? There is a flow two ways. So if you create a dot in here, this dot will appear in here. You create dot in here, this dot will appear in here. Okay? So that's under false. If we have true, which is true. So now, true case. The flow will be a little bit different. Flow will be one way. So think of it this way. So if you create, let's say you create a dot in here, dot will appear in here. You create dot in here, dot will not appear in here because it's only one way. So if you create dot in here, they will appear in here. But again, you can create as many dots or variables in here. They do not transition to here. Okay, so just think about it this way. Okay, so look, the child can use parent variable. So we can see that we can still see parent string. Now, let's create, okay, let's go to the parent and see if the parent can use this variable, which is dir_var. Okay, let's create a, so this is the controller, right? So let's create a, I don't know, h1 tag, and let's put the child variable into it. You will see that it will break. You see nothing is appearing. That's because the parent cannot see the child. Because if you look at the parent, you see there is no dir_var in it. This variable doesn't exist inside the parent. So again, just think of it as this way. It flows one way, from parent to child, but not from child to parent. All right, and then final one, which is a completely isolated scope, is we do basically like this. This is where it becomes pretty much React at this stage. The only way that the child can see the parent variables is two ways. One way you pass it through property, which is exactly like in React, or you have to access it through parent scope. I'll show you how to do it. It's going to get a little bit confusing because you on one side we're saying you don't have access to parent scope, but you actually do, but it's actually a different way that you can access it. So the first thing we're going to notice, we set this to isolated scope. We lost the access to the parent scope. Okay, so we can look at it and we will see that this is no longer visible because, again, the child no longer inherits the parent variables. Right now, I'll give you kind of, I have to take a step back. So when we look at the parent, we see oh, whoops, I need true, my apologies. Okay, so look, parent has parent string. Okay, you do not see parent string in here, but you can see it under parent. You see this parent scope. We can see parent string in here, and this is why this is works. So the child can instantly, directly use the parent variables without using this thing here. Now, under this setting, it will still work because it has access to the parent scope, and it can directly use it without needing this parent thingy, parent object, whatever you call it, right? So you see, when you set this to true, both ways is going to work. But once you remove this, this no longer works because you don't have direct access to the parent scope. However, you still can do it through the parent object. This is where it gets confusing. Like this is kind of why I think AngularJs is, on surface, when you start working with it, it looks cool. But when you start thinking about the infrastructure of code, it becomes horrendous. And when dealing with this in my project right now is because just finding stuff becomes very difficult because you don't know where the stuff is coming from. So you see, in child, right, we have child has the parent, and this way we can access the parent scope. But if we try to do it directly, it doesn't work because you lost the access to the parent scope. So I don't know, on Miro it's still this way, but the only way to access it is through like this. So fundamentally, the question will be, what's the difference between true and what's the difference between this and this? So in true, you don't have to use the, you don't have to do it this way to have access to parent variable. You can just use it directly, right? But under true, you cannot pass properties into the scope. You cannot do it, right? But if you want to pass properties and have isolated scope, you can do it through the object like this, but you immediately lose access to the parent. So the only way to access parent is like this. But the correct way to do that, of course, is to pass it as a property. And then that's about it. Okay, so now let's summarize. Let's summarize, right? So we have parent and the child. In case we have false, this means that the scope from parent gets directly passed, inherited into the child. So the flow is like this. So if you create a dot in here, it will appear in here. If you create dot in here, it will appear in here. Okay? So that's under false. So now let's talk about what happens when it's true. Okay, so when it's true, what happens is the flow is this way. So if you create dot in the parent, child will see it. You create another dot in parent, child will see it. If you create a dot in child, parent will not see it. Okay? Now the benefit of doing that, of course, is you can access these dots instantly without the need to write parent dot. So you do not need this part here. You can just put dot, and it's going to instantly know that it's this dot here, one of those dots. Okay, so that's the benefit. Now, the third option, of course, is which is put it as a object. Okay, so what happens, you still get this flow. Everything is exactly the same as in true. The only difference is that to access parent, you have to do the parent like this. Dot. And then the only way to pass properties in here, either through parent, or you can just, you basically get access to ability to pass the properties. And then that's about it. Okay, take care, bye-bye.